3 of this lecture on the French Revolution, really looking at political reactions to the French Revolution. I want to look at how the French Revolution influenced each of the 3 great 19th century ideologies of liberalism, conservatism and socialism. Liberalism we can deal with quite briefly. We've already seen how liberalism represented, how the French Revolution represented the crystallization of the liberal program of constitutionalism, representative government and equality under the law. As such, its program effectively became the model for pretty much all liberal parties thereafter. But the French Revolution was also the inspiration, albeit in very different ways, for both conservatism and socialism as well. So, remember, modern conservatism as a fully fledged ideology is thought to begin with. Pause the video here, remind yourself which thinker? That's right, Edmund Burke, former Whig and MP for Bristol. Now pause the video again and remind yourself which pamphlet of his is considered to be the founding document of modern conservatism. That's right, Reflections on the Revolution in France, published in 1790, a year after the start of the Revolution. And it was particularly significant because, as I say, Burke had been a member of the Whig faction in Parliament, considered the predecessors of the Liberal Party, not the Conservative Party. And he had supported the American Revolution against British rule as well, and as well as at first supporting the uprising in France. But it was the actions taken by the Parisian masses and their attempt to storm the royal palace in 1790 in particular that turned him against the revolution. Like Hobbes, Burke believed that revolutions such as this threatened to bring chaos and bloodshed and should therefore be opposed. When the events of 1793 and the Great Terror unfolded, it seemed to many that Burke's predictions were being borne out. Like Hobbes too, he believed that humans were at heart primarily security-seeking creatures, and that they would therefore, when confronted with the chaos their actions had unleashed, flock to a military strongman, one perhaps even more tyrannical than the one they'd just overthrown, to restore order. Again, the emergence of Napoleon seemed to confirm Burke's thesis, as did the emergence of Stalin following the Russian Revolution of 1917, over 100 years later. Yet it should be remembered that Burke had in fact supported some revolutions. He believed in the English Glorious Revolution of 1688. He believed that was justified, and he supported the American Revolution against British rule in 1776. What particularly bothered Burke about the French Revolution was in fact precisely its rationalism. Revolutions were only justified, Burke argued, when they were attempts to restore long-established rights, customs and traditions which had been usurped by a ruler. Revolutions were justified, in other words, to maintain traditional institutions which were under threat, but never were they justified in order to establish new ones. And this argument is rooted in Burke's view of human nature. He completely rejected the Enlightenment view held by liberals such as John Locke, that humans are inherently rational, guided by rational self-interest. Rather, his view was influenced by Catholic ideas of original sin, and similar to Hobbes, that humans' capacity for rationality is inherently fragile and weak, and easily eclipsed by more base motives such as greed, envy, lust for power, and so on. Furthermore, he believed that society was too complex to be fully comprehended by the human mind. In other words, he believed human nature to be not perfectible, as the liberals believed, but deeply and fundamentally flawed, limited. And therefore, any attempt to create rational institutions from scratch, relying on our own flawed and faulty and limited reason, would also necessarily therefore be deeply flawed. And this was necessarily the case, as they would be attempting to impose their own flawed blueprints on a society that was necessarily beyond the scope of their understanding. And the result would be a whole range of unforeseen consequences, resulting in chaos, bloodshed, and ultimately the reimposition of tyranny. So Burke completely rejected one of the basic premises of the Enlightenment, that institutions can be only justified through reason. Instead, Burke believed that the real test of the worth of an institution was not its adherence to flawed human reason, but rather whether or not it had stood the test of time. In other words, tradition. For Burke, tradition represented precisely something that had stood the test of time, encompassing the wisdom and experience of the ages. Our flawed reason might not be able to understand why an institution such as the monarchy, or the 7-day week, or the hereditary power of the aristocracy should have been so successful, but the very fact that it had endured proved for Burke that it worked and should therefore be respected and preserved. Nonetheless, this did not mean that Burke believed society should not be changed. In order to avoid the chaos of revolution, rulers needed to be sympathetic to the needs and demands of their subjects. Unlike the absolutist rulers of much of Europe at the time, Burke advocated the principle of change to conserve, small, careful, pragmatic reforms aimed at ensuring institutions remained relevant and functional in changing times. It's the UK monarchy's adherence to this principle, Burke's modern supporters argue, that has ensured their survival, where so many of their European counterparts have fallen by the wayside. So to sum up, the French Revolution had a profound impact on Burke, with his critique of the revolutionaries providing the foundation of modern conservatism. He believed that revolutions were only justified so long as they aimed to restore pre-existing rights and customs, and that revolutions which aimed to impose their own supposedly rational blueprint on society were doomed to create chaos and bloodshed, ultimately resulting in a worse tyranny than the one they'd overthrown. The revolutionaries' chief mistake, he argued, was their misplaced faith in the capacity of human reason. Society was better organized, he argued, around the traditional institutions which had stood the test of time. Nevertheless, he believed that rulers did need to be willing to change to conserve, to make careful pragmatic reforms in line with changing circumstances in order to avert the danger of fully fledged revolution. We see later on how Disraeli develops this idea of change to conserve with the kind of invention of one nation conservatism in the 1870s. But that's a story for another day. Okay, so what I've tried to show you so far was how it was really precisely Edmund Burke's reaction against the French Revolution that gave birth to modern conservatism. And what about socialism then? So whilst modern conservatism was born as a reaction against the French Revolution and the Enlightenment ideals it represented, modern socialism can be seen as an attempt to push the revolution and the Enlightenment to its logical conclusion. Remember, the slogan of the French Revolution had been Liberté, Égalité and Fraternité, that is, liberty, equality and brotherhood. But socialists such as Marx and Engels believed that because of the bourgeois nature of the revolution, it had failed to achieve these aspirations. Consider equality. For the bourgeois liberals, who ultimately triumphed in the French Revolution, equality simply meant political and legal equality. In other words, an end to the feudal privileges of clergy and nobility, an end to differing inherited legal and political statuses. But for socialists, this was not true equality at all. The heart of their argument was best expressed, in my opinion, by the 19th century writer and thinker and satirist Auguste France, when he wrote that, quote, "The law in its majestic equality forbids the rich as well as the poor to sleep under bridges, to beg in the streets, and to steal bread." You can see he was being ironic. What he was getting at clearly was the idea that equality is meaningless if it does not include equality of access to resources. For socialists then, political and legal equality was not enough. To be really meaningful, equality had to also mean social and economic equality. These ideas were expressed during the revolution itself, but were not able to come to fruition. The conspiracy of equals, for example, was an attempt at, if you like, a revolution within the revolution. It was an attempt in 1796 to overthrow the moderate bourgeois revolutionary government and replace it with a radical socialist one. It was led by Francois Babeuf, and the conspirators declared that, quote, "Nature has given to every man the right to the enjoyment of an equal share in all property." So you can see how this was clearly an early socialist, even early communist program. At the start of their uprising, they read out a decree which read that, quote, "All property currently owned by private individuals will, upon their death, fall to the national community. The goods of the national community will be exploited collectively by all its valid members. The national community will provide each of its members with decent accommodation, clothing, adequate food, and relief in the art of healing." Healthcare in today's terms. So you can see what they're saying, that the wealth, people's individual wealth, should in fact, on their death, pass to the community as a whole and be used to provide the necessaries of life to the whole community: food, shelter, clothing, and so on. Basic communist principle. So for Marx and Engels, the conspiracy of equals represented, quote, "the first appearance of a truly active communist party." But for the socialists, it was not only equality that could not be fully realized, within bourgeois society. It was liberty as well. For the liberals of the time, that is, for classical liberals, liberty simply meant the absence of constraint, generally understood as the absence of state control of the private affairs of individuals. Their religion, their political beliefs and activities, their choice of work, the use of their own property, and so on. This is what Isaiah Berlin had termed negative liberty. But socialists believed in positive liberty. For them, a man with no bread has no liberty. Anyone without the means of their own survival could not be said to be free in any meaningful sense at all. For them to be truly free meant to be free to fully realize and develop one's own capacities and talents. This is what Berlin termed positive liberty, and it would later be adopted by modern liberals as well, as we shall see. So, once again, for the early socialists, liberty could only be realized by the abolition of private property. It was only through common ownership of property that all would be able to access the resources necessary to realize their talents and express their true individuality. In a society based on private ownership, this liberty was in fact available only to the rich. The same was true for fraternity, which basically just means brotherhood. For Marx and Engels, fraternity had been a clever slogan used by the French bourgeoisie to persuade the peasants and proletarians to join forces with them. But genuine fraternity was impossible in a capitalist society, which is inevitably based on competition, greed, and the enriching of oneself at the expense of one's neighbour. For Marx and Engels, different classes, such as the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, had irreconcilable interests. The one could only advance at the expense of the other. And even within each class, dog-eat-dog competition was the rule. Companies in a constant war to put each other out of business, workers in a constant struggle against one another for scarce jobs, and so on. Fraternity was impossible in such a society. Only a communist society, in which classes had been abolished, argued Marx, could genuine fraternity flourish. So for socialists, the French Revolution was based on a promise it could not deliver, the promise of liberty, equality, and fraternity. These were things that only full-blooded socialism, the abolition of private property and its replacement by the common ownership of property for the common benefit of all, could accomplish. To fulfill the bourgeoisie's own professed goals, therefore, the bourgeoisie themselves would have to be overthrown. This brings us to the second great influence of the French Revolution on socialism. As well as influencing its ideals and goals, it also provided a blueprint for revolution itself. For Marx and Engels, the French Revolution was fundamentally a bourgeois revolution. It represented the overthrow of the aristocracy by the bourgeoisie and the replacement of the feudal system of production by the capitalist system of production. The Proletarian Revolution, they believed, would follow the lead of the bourgeois and would do as they had done. For Marx and Engels, the historical role of the proletariat was to overthrow the bourgeoisie just as the bourgeoisie had overthrown the aristocracy, and to usher in the socialist system just as the bourgeoisie had ushered in the capitalist system. The difference was that the socialist system of production, by abolishing classes altogether, would actually be in the universal interests of all humanity, whilst the feudal and capitalist systems had represented only the interests of the aristocracy and the bourgeoisie respectively. Only the socialist system was genuinely beneficial, but only the proletariat can bring it about. And we can say that really socialism in this sense was also the kind of apotheosis of the Enlightenment, the kind of the logical peak of Enlightenment thought, because Enlightenment thought was as well as other things about the idea of universalism, that there are things that are universal to all humanity. And so in practice, this Marxism sought to realize this universalism in practice by abolishing classes, making everyone equal in the sense of not being privileged or in an exploitative relation with someone else. In conclusion, we can see that what the French Revolution did was to bring the proletariat, the masses, or the mob, onto the world stage as historical agents for arguably the first time in history. The question was, as a recent article on the subject put it, was whether to denounce or embrace the masses' entry onto the world stage. For conservatives, the entry of the masses onto the political scene was a disaster, which could only bring chaos and bloodshed, something to be avoided at all costs. It was no coincidence that it was specifically a riot led by women, who were then largely seen by bourgeois society as a repository of humanity's most irrational elements, that terrified Burke into his denunciation of the revolution. For liberals, the masses had a role, but it was to be a passive one. They were to serve as the appendages of the bourgeoisie, the truly rational, educated elites who should really control society. This fear of democracy as mob rule was to plague liberalism for at least a century to come. It was only the socialists who believed the entry of the masses onto the historical stage was something to be welcomed, embraced and developed. For the socialists, the masses themselves should be in direct control of political affairs. They advocated a proletarian state to oversee the building of socialism, and argued that only this, a state of the masses, would represent genuine democracy. Okay, hope this has been useful, giving you a bit of context to the emergence of 19th century conservatism and socialism as reactions to, responses to the French Revolution, the bourgeois liberal revolution in France that began in 1789. Thanks for listening.